So I did my undergrad at the University of Waterloo in Canada, and where I studied health studies. When I was doing undergrad, I kind of didn't really discover epidemiology per se. I like to say, I was too busy trying to save the world. You could find me at every protest, always trying to put together some new talk or invite a lecture or something, Then ended up moving back to Oman, the country of Oman, where my family was residing. While I was there, ended up working with the United Nations for a while, the United Nations Population Fund, then got into some consulting, working with an environmental consultancy group. And when I was with them, that's when I kind of realized, well, my favorite course during undergrad was actually a course in environmental health. And, so this is apparently a career. To do my master's, went to the US to do that, did my master's, my MPH at the George Washington University. Graduated, moved back to Canada, where I worked for the government for a couple of years, decided I wanted to do my PhD. So then went back to the US again, at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, where I got my doctorate in environmental health sciences. Moved back to Canada again and was a postdoc at the University of Toronto in Scarborough for a while, where I kind of wanted to get a little bit more experience working on chronic diseases and mental health, because I was really interested in the mixture of different chemicals, as well as the impact of psychosocial stress in chemicals. So I kind of wanted to sort of explore that a little bit. So my first postdoc was kind of left environmental epidemiology for a little bit, focused on in mental health, and then went back to environmental epidemiology in my current postdoc, where I work at the Université Laval in Quebec. I currently look at the exposure sources and health impacts of a group of chemicals called PFAS, alongside our Inuit communities up in the Arctic. Because I got the job during the pandemic, I never actually ended up moving to Quebec, still based out of a town outside of Toronto. So I'm still based in Ontario. In Quebec, I've been working with them now for about a year and a half-ish. ISEE, definitely during my PhD was the first time I really got involved with them. And it was, a bunch of people from my department were attending the ISEE conference, and I was really interested in just presenting a poster at the time. So I didn't really know very much about ISEE, except that it was a place to, advertise your research. So the first conference I attended was I think it was the one in Brazil back in 2015. I think that was my first one. Now, I just loved it. I absolutely loved it. I loved listening to all the different types of research that was presented at ISEE. I loved all the different activities they had planned that kind of catered to those that love the outings and the parties and all of that, to people who sort of like, the little conversations and stuff. So absolutely loved it, started attending every single year, and then became a lot more involved at ISEE, actually through the Eastern Mediterranean chapter. They had just started the chapter, I want to say about 3-4 years ago now. Even though I'm based in North America, I'm of Palestinian descent. And I really wanted to sort of just bring the research back. I'd always been heavily involved with sort of getting in contact with researchers back in Palestine or in the region, and try to sort of build up the environmental health field in the region. I got in touch with the chapter and started the SNRN kind of subgroup of that chapter. And it was through that involvement that I became part of the SNRN, and then got into all these other committees from there. So I've only really been very involved with ISEE for the last 2 years or so. The chapter leader for the Eastern Mediterranean chapter, Wael Delemi. He is a professor based out of California, and very, very inspiring researcher who's been heavily involved throughout the committees and stuff. And so he was really the one who kind of sparked my interest of getting more involved in ISEE. The way that it's really inspired me the most was just really attending all the different lectures. They sort of really opened my eyes to different ways of looking at a specific problem, be it through mixtures of different chemicals or a different methodology to try to combine all the different stressors, or it could just be a nuance of a problem I'd never heard of before, and how could that possibly impact the problem that I'm currently studying? Or the other thing I really enjoyed, there was a talk that I had gone to one of my first years at ISEE. So this was back in 2014, 2015. I can't remember what the topic was exactly, but that they had invited an Indigenous elder from the US. Outside of that, what really inspired me the most, what I really enjoyed about the ISEE conference, was that while there was the large majority of the conversations are obviously scientific, that it was open to different types of conversations, including those where they're kind of just adding a human face, where you can really sort of see the impact at the community level, and that because I've been to other conferences before, and they were just very, very, very purely technical. And while ISEE is extremely technical, it still kind of had some room to have those conversations and sort of invite those kind of, the kind of people who are really truly being impacted by the chemicals that we face every day. So that, I would say, was really kind of what opened my eyes to community-based research, which is where I am now. So just the breadth of the research that takes place at ISEE is, I'd say the number one thing that I've gained from being a part of the society. And then the other part of it is just connections. I've managed to meet a lot of phenomenal people at ISEE, and particularly during my time at the committees, and connected me to, these incredible professors that I wouldn't have been able to get access to, even at the university setting. The research I'm doing right now is a community-based participatory research project, which means that we work hand in hand with our Inuit colleagues. They are a very big part of the project, where they help us come up with the actual research questions. In fact, the majority of the research questions are community concerns that they bring to us. And then they are involved with the actual interpretation of the results. They're involved in the write-up of the manuscripts, be it, to be submitted to a scientific publication or just a public report for their own governmental or regional efforts. What I love most about this project is that you can just sort of see the impact behind it. When we come in as scientists, we're not coming in as leaders. We're not coming in as, those who are kind of, coming in, as the experts and telling, the little people what to do. It's really us coming in to support the community. These are their concerns. This is what they think might be the problem. We're coming in to examine them, to help them reach whatever goals they have. The chemicals of concern that I'm studying right now are PFAS, which are a group of persistent organic pollutants. And the sad part of the story is that a lot of the PFAS chemicals arrive in the Arctic because of our usage of these chemicals down in southern latitudes. So up in the Arctic, you've probably imagined there aren't a lot of contamination sites for PFAS and the like, but it's just because basically of a lot of the chemicals that we use down south, because of atmospheric and oceanic transport, they end up in the Arctic. And then because of a lot of these unique environmental conditions in the Arctic, they end up getting stuck there. The Arctic acts as a sink, and then they end up getting biomagnified in the food webs up in the Arctic. The Inuit people consume a lot of the species, and they end up with some of the highest concentrations of PFAS worldwide. As an example, there's PFNA concentrations in the community we're working with right now are 7-fold higher in Nunavut, Quebec, as compared to those in the general Canadian population. So we're really trying to understand exactly what these exposure sources are. So we think that it's most likely because of that biomagnification and the fact that it ends up in the wildlife and in the species that they consume. But we really want to try to explore it a little bit better to understand exactly which species are the ones that are accumulating the most and most PFAS, or if there's specific parts of the animal, not just the animal itself, but is it the tail, is it the liver, or whatever it may be. Now with PFAS, they do tend to accumulate more in the liver, but some of the epi studies that I've been conducting are showing that there's quite a bit of PFAS as well in the blubber, which is a surprising finding. So we're trying to explore that a little bit more, trying to understand what's happening. And then the other part of my study is to try to understand the health impacts associated with all of these, with the PFAS concentrations. So I'm looking at everything from cardiometabolic diseases. We're also analyzing some immune biomarkers right now. We are also looking at respiratory diseases because there's a really high rate of wheezing in the region. So we think that it might have to do with PFAS because there was a study that found that PFAS could probably accumulate in the lungs. So we kind of want to look into that. We also put in a proposal right now to try to look at some thyroid biomarkers. So we're just looking at a range of different outcomes in association with PFAS. So there was a survey that was conducted up in Nunavut back in 2017. And it was able to recruit about 1,000, or just a little over 1,300 individuals aged 16 and up. So it's pretty representative of the region. And what was also really great about this survey is that it follows OCAP principles, which means that the community members themselves, they own, control, possess the data completely. So we have to ask for permission for every single thing we want to do. The other part of what we're trying to do right now, so Canada had recently nominated a subset of these PFAS chemicals to be included in the Stockholm Convention list of persistent organic pollutants. So basically, they're nominating for them to be internationally banned. And it includes chemicals like that PFNA chemical that I had previously mentioned. A couple of other scientists, myself, as well as our Inuit colleagues, We have been attending the Stockholm Convention meetings. We attended our first one back in January. We're attending a second one in September, where we're presenting our results to support the Canadian nomination to ban these chemicals. Being part of the Eastern Mediterranean chapter was great because I believe it was really the first of its kind to try to bring researchers together from across the region to look at these environmental health research in general, but then also really sort of discuss environmental health topics with researchers across the entire region. In terms of what I gained the most was really sort of learning from all these different researchers. Even though I spent the majority of my life, living in the Eastern Mediterranean region, there were so many different topics that I'd never really thought about. For example, in one of our most recent conversations, we had wanted to talk about justice, environmental justice in the region. And we had researchers coming in to talk to us from their perspective in Lebanon. And, and which was very different from the perspective of our Palestinian collaborators. Because of course, then they had to bring in, conversations on the occupation and how that impacts environmental justice. And then we also had conversations I was having over email from another collaborator in Iran. And, so what environmental justice looks like in Iran. So even though I was the one who was really sort of chairing this and, and bringing these conversations together, I felt like I was the one that was learning the most, it was such an incredible avenue to try to flesh out all of these different problems together. The SNRN is probably my favorite chapter. As much as I enjoy being part of the Eastern Mediterranean chapter, the SNRN it really kind of reminds me just how many ideas young researchers have. We're a very, very active committee. Being part of SNRN, that in itself has been an incredible experience because it gives you exposure to all of these other types of committee. Because even if you're not involved with, like for example, I'm not part of the policy committee, but I get to hear about the workings of the policy committee because of our representative, the SNRN representative there. It's been a fantastic committee to be a part of.